Hello there. My name is Bill McKibben, and I'm an environmentalist and a writer. I actually wrote the first book about climate change for a general audience way back in 1989. A book called The End of Nature that came out in 24 languages around the world, including Italian, and was the sort of on the very beginning of the public fight over climate change. And so I thought I might spend just a couple of minutes talking about how that fight evolved and where we are now. When it began in the 1980s, I think the assumption of most of us who were working on this question was that our governments would respond to the evidence that scientists were compiling. And so the job was to win that argument, to have more books and more symposiums and more papers, and eventually our leaders would get the idea and join in. Well, by the mid-1990s, the argument was over. The world's scientists were clearly in agreement about what was going on and how bad it was going to be. The argument was over, but nothing was happening. And that's when some of us began to understand that we were not actually engaged in an argument, we were engaged in a fight. And the fight, as fights usually are, was about money and power, not data and reason. And the other side in this fight was the fossil fuel industry, who didn't want to change their business model, even if it meant breaking the planet. We know now, over the last few years, there's been great investigative reporting and whistleblowers and archives and things. So we know now that right back when I was writing that first book, the fossil fuel industry was also doing its own investigations into climate change. And then in the 1980s, they understood perfectly well what was going to happen. Exxon scientists predicted what the temperature and the CO2 concentration would be in 2020, and they were spot on. And they were believed. Companies like Exxon began building their drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was on the way. But they didn't tell the rest of us. Instead, the industry worked to build this whole huge edifice of deceit and denial and disinformation that kept too much of the world doing nothing for too long. And so, beginning to understand this 10 or 15 years ago, some of us went to work to build movements to try and counter that money. 350.org, which I helped found, was the first iteration of a global climate campaign. And by 2009, for instance, we had a day of action with 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries around the world. CNN called it the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. But most of those demonstrations were still small, 100 or 200 people in each place, because, you have to start somewhere. And one of the great stories of the last decade has been the rise of this movement, with so many groups and people flooding in. Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement, the Green New Deal, Fridays for the Future with school kids around the globe. I think it's legitimate now to say that this is the largest movement on the planet, maybe the largest in the planet's history, which is a good thing because it's the first truly planetary emergency that we've ever faced. The other piece of good news for the last 10 years is that the engineers have done their job remarkably well and dropped the price of sun and wind power 90%, so that renewable energy no longer needs to be alternative. It's now the most obvious choice, the cheapest way to generate power on our planet. And together, these two things, movement power and engineering power, give us a chance. If we wanted to, we could make change fast. So the question falls around that last word, fast. This is not like other problems we face, other political problems where we can do a little bit of work and come back a few years later and do a little more and so on and so forth. This is a time-limited problem. Physics and chemistry set the parameters, and if we don't meet them, we will lose. If we don't solve it soon, we will never solve it. And you can see already that happening as ice melts at the North and South poles, as coral reefs vanish, as forests go up in flames, as the toll of carbon in the atmosphere gets ever higher. So there's got to have to be extraordinary work over the next 10 years. The last 10 years have set the stage for this, and this coming decade has to be the period when that work comes to full fruition, which means we need everybody on board, and we need everybody working hard to counter the baleful influence of the fossil fuel industry. Because though they're not as strong as they were 10 years ago, they're still strong enough to keep us from moving as fast as we need to go. That's what the fight looks like around the world. I try neither to be optimistic nor pessimistic. I think it's important that we just get up every day and do what we can. We're obviously not going to stop global warming. Too late for that, but we may be able to stop it at 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. If we stay on the current trajectory that we're on now, 3 or 4 degrees Celsius climate change, then we won't be able to have civilizations like the ones we're accustomed to. The damage will be too great. And I think the answer to that will be provided in the next decade. So we work very hard all over the world. Though individual action is very important, though I'm very proud of the solar panels on my roof, it's clear that we can't solve this crisis one electric car or one vegan dinner at a time. We need very much to have people come together in groups large enough to make the economic and political change we need. The most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements that can change things at a deep level. So many thanks for being part of that effort, and I look forward to working shoulder to shoulder with you all.